Imagine an arrow that could pierce through the finest armor ever forged, yet left no visible wound on the surface. Sound impossible? Yet Roman physicians documented soldiers dying hours after battle with nothing but a tiny puncture mark, their organs liquefied from the inside. But the world of ancient projectiles holds far more than simple pointed sticks flying through the air. These were precision-engineered instruments of death, each one designed with a specific, brutal purpose. Consider this: archaeologists discovered arrowheads in Persia that were deliberately forged with microscopic barbs facing backward. Once they entered flesh, removing them would tear through muscle and arteries like a saw blade. In China, bronze-tipped arrows were found containing traces of aconite poison so potent that a single scratch could paralyze a war elephant within minutes. Today, we'll uncover 5 of the most lethal arrow types ever deployed in ancient warfare, each one more ingeniously deadly than the last. And the first one was designed specifically to make sure its victims never saw a battlefield surgeon alive. Arrow 1. The bodkin point, the armor pisser. Picture a medieval knight, encased head to toe in armor that took master craftsmen months to forge. He feels invincible. Then comes a sound like hail on metal, and suddenly, he's on his knees, steel pierced clean through. The bodkin point arrow didn't just penetrate armor. It ignored it. Here's what made it terrifying. While most arrowheads were designed with broad, cutting edges, the bodkin was different. It was essentially a long, narrow spike, sometimes square in cross-section, sometimes circular, but always tapering to a needle-fine point. Picture an ice pick the length of your hand, and you're getting close. But here's the genius, and the horror. When a bodkin struck plate armor, it didn't try to cut through the metal. Instead, that narrow point would find microscopic imperfections in the surface and concentrate all the kinetic energy from a 100-pound war bow into a space smaller than a pinhead. The metal would actually deform and split, creating a hole just wide enough for the shaft to punch through. English longbowmen during the 100 Years' War would fire these at massed French cavalry from 200 yards away. Chronicles from the Battle of Agincourt in 1415 describe knights who made it through the arrow storm looking like pincushions, bodkins protruding from shoulder plates, helmets, even leg armor. The arrows were so deeply embedded that squires needed specialized tools to extract them from corpses. But what most people don't know is this: the bodkin's true lethality wasn't just about penetration. Medieval armor makers caught on quickly and started increasing plate thickness. So English fletchers adapted. They began forging bodkins with a subtle taper that would cause them to tumble after penetrating the first layer of defense. Here's what that means. The arrow would punch through the armor straight, but once it was inside, the irregular shape would cause it to flip and yaw, creating a wound channel that was far wider internally than the entry hole suggested. A knight might look down at a relatively small puncture in his breastplate, thinking he'd survived, only to discover that internally, the bodkin had carved through muscle, cracked ribs, and punctured organs. French military physicians of the era wrote in frustration about soldiers who walked off the battlefield apparently fine, only to collapse hours later from internal hemorrhaging. The entry wound was so small it was often missed during field triage. And here's the darkest part of the bodkin's design. It was meant to stay in. Unlike broad hunting arrows that could sometimes be pushed through or pulled out, the bodkin's narrow profile meant it would slip between ribs, lodge against bone, or embed in muscle so deeply that medieval surgery, already barbaric, became a death sentence in itself. Attempting extraction would cause more damage than leaving it in, but leaving it in meant infection, blood poisoning, and a slow death weeks after the battle was won. The bodkin point was still in military use through the 16th century, even as firearms began to dominate battlefields. Why? Because early plate armor that could stop a musket ball often couldn't stop a well-placed bodkin from a skilled archer at close range. But as deadly as the bodkin was against armored opponents, it was completely wrong for a different kind of target. And that's where our next arrow comes in. One specifically engineered not to pierce, but to tear. Arrow 2, the broadhead, the flesh destroyer. The bodkin was made to fight metal. The broadhead was made to fight meat. Imagine being struck by an arrowhead the width of your palm, with edges so sharp they could shave hair, designed with one purpose: to create a wound so catastrophic that death would come in minutes, not hours. The broadhead wasn't just sharp, it was wide. We're talking 2 to 4 inches across, sometimes more, with cutting edges that met at precise angles calculated to slice through muscle, sever arteries, and create hemorrhaging that no amount of medieval battlefield medicine could stop. But here's what makes the broadhead truly diabolical. It wasn't designed to kill on impact. It was designed to kill through blood loss. Native American tribes, particularly the Lakota and Apache, perfected versions of this arrow type for hunting bison, animals with thick hides and massive body mass that could shrug off narrower projectiles. But when European colonists first encountered broadhead-armed warriors in combat, they were horrified by the wounds they produced on human targets. A Spanish conquistador's journal from 1540 describes an encounter in what is now Arizona. The arrows of these natives bear heads as wide as a man's hand, and when they strike, they do not pierce deep, but open the flesh in such manner that a man's life pours out upon the ground in moments. Our armor avails us nothing, for the arrows find the joints and openings, and there is no binding the wounds they make. Here's the mechanical reality. When a broadhead strikes flesh, those razor-sharp edges don't just puncture, they slice. The wide profile means they cut through multiple tissue planes simultaneously. Hit an arm, and the broadhead might sever muscle groups from bone. Strike the torso, and it could open the abdominal wall, exposing internal organs. A hit to the neck or thigh, where major arteries run close to the surface, meant you had minutes to live, maybe less. But the genius, and the cruelty, goes deeper than the initial wound. Broadheads were often designed with barbs. Not large, dramatic hooks like you'd see in movies, but small, angled protrusions along the cutting edges. Here's what they did. Entry was relatively smooth because the arrow's forward momentum forced tissue to part along the blade edges. But removal? Those barbs would catch on muscle fiber, blood vessels, and connective tissue. Pulling the arrow out became a secondary injury, often far worse than the initial strike. Medieval European battlefield surgeons developed a terrible reputation for having to push arrows completely through the body rather than extract them backward, because a barbed broadhead pulled in reverse could tear arteries, rip through organs, and turn a survivable wound into a death sentence. Chronicles from the Crusades describe soldiers begging to be killed outright rather than endure the extraction process. And here's something most people never consider. Broadheads were also psychological weapons. Unlike the relatively small puncture of a bodkin, a broadhead wound was visible. Soldiers watching their companion struck by a broadhead would see the massive trauma, the explosive hemorrhaging, and the rapid death. It created terror in a way that invisible internal injuries couldn't match. Armies facing broadhead-equipped archers often broke formation not because of casualties, but because witnessing the wounds was psychologically devastating. Persian and Turkish horse archers took this even further. They developed broadheads with crescent moon shapes, sometimes called swallowtail points, that were specifically designed to strike horses rather than riders. A single arrow to a horse's neck or chest would open wounds that couldn't be stanched in the chaos of cavalry combat. The animal would collapse within a minute, throwing its rider and creating chaos in densely packed cavalry formations. But here's the question nobody asks. If broadheads were so effective against flesh, and bodkins were engineered for armor, why didn't armies just use both types? They did. And that's where arrow warfare became truly strategic. Skilled archers would carry multiple arrow types in their quivers, selecting them based on the target. See a knight in full plate? Reach for a bodkin. Facing lightly armored infantry or cavalry horses. Broadhead. This wasn't random violence, this was surgical, tactical thinking where the choice of arrow type could determine whether you survived the next 60 seconds. But as effective as both the bodkin and broadhead were, neither could solve a specific problem that plagued ancient armies. How do you hit an enemy you can't even see clearly through the chaos of battle? That's where our third arrow type comes in. And this one didn't need to hit its target at all to be lethal. But before moving on, I would like to ask you for something. If you like these documentaries and want to support me, please consider subscribing, it's free. Arrow 3, the fire arrow, the psychological destroyer. Forget everything you've seen in movies. Real fire arrows weren't about shooting flames through the air. They were about turning your enemy's greatest defensive advantage into their tomb. Picture this, it's 200 BCE in China during the Warring States period. Your army has spent months besieging a fortified city with wooden walls and thatched roofs. Conventional arrows have been ineffective. The defenders simply hunker down behind their fortifications. Then, at dusk, the sky turns orange. Not with sunset, but with thousands of arrows trailing smoke and flame, arcing over the walls. Within minutes, the city isn't a fortress anymore. It's a furnace. Here's what actually made fire arrows effective. They weren't single arrows with burning tips. They were systems, carefully engineered devices that combined projectile technology with incendiary chemistry. Chinese military treatises from the 4th century BCE describe the construction in detail. Arrows would be fitted with specialized heads, not sharp points, but hollow containers made from bronze or iron. These chambers were packed with materials that sound almost modern. Mixtures of sulfur, saltpeter, resin, and oils that could burn even in damp conditions. Some versions included fragments of pottery or metal that would explode outward when the materials ignited, creating an early form of shrapnel. But here's the genius. The arrows weren't meant to burn in flight. They were ignited just before impact or designed with chemical mixtures that would ignite on contact with air after the protective casing shattered. Why does that matter? Because an arrow on fire during flight is actually less effective. The heat damages the shaft, the flames create drag, and accuracy plummets. But an arrow that becomes a fire source after landing? That's a weapon delivery system. Byzantine armies during the 7th to 10th centuries perfected a variation using what they called Greek fire, a napalm-like substance that we still don't fully understand the composition of, over 1,000 years later. What we know from contemporary accounts is terrifying. It burned on water, couldn't be extinguished by conventional means, and stuck to whatever it touched, continuing to burn through flesh and wood until the fuel was completely consumed. Byzantine fire arrows using variants of this compound weren't just incendiary weapons. They were tactical tools that could disable siege equipment, destroy supply depots, and create firebreaks that divided enemy formations. But here's what makes fire arrows truly interesting from a military history perspective. Their primary effect wasn't physical damage. It was psychological warfare at scale. Think about the human relationship with fire. It's primal. We've feared uncontrolled fire since before we were fully human. Now imagine being a soldier in a medieval siege, huddled with thousands of others in a confined space built from wood and thatch. You hear a whistling sound. You look up. The sky is raining fire. Panic in densely packed medieval formations could kill more people than the flames themselves. Soldiers would stampede, crush each other, abandon positions, and create chaos that attacking forces could exploit. Chinese military strategist Sun Tzu specifically wrote about fire attacks as tools for creating disorder rather than direct casualties. Attack with fire when conditions allow. Be ready to press the advantage when chaos erupts. And here's something darker. Fire arrows were often used as signals. During the Mongol invasions of the 13th century, commanders would use fire arrows to mark targets for massed archery, to signal cavalry charges, or to coordinate multi-front attacks. A volley of fire arrows over a specific section of wall meant concentrate fire here or prepare for assault. Defending forces, seeing fire arrows launch from multiple positions, would know they were surrounded before they ever saw the ground troops. The Japanese took this to an extreme during the Sengo period, 15th to 17th centuries. They developed fire arrows called haya that were essentially rocket-propelled incendiaries. Packed with gunpowder in bamboo tubes, they would scream as they flew, an audio component specifically designed to maximize terror. Imagine defending a castle at night, and suddenly the darkness erupts with dozens of shrieking, flaming projectiles that crash into your position, spreading fire and panic simultaneously. But fire arrows had a limitation. They required specific conditions, dry weather, flammable targets, and enough arrows to create sustained burning. They were devastating in sieges but less effective in open field battles. So what happened when armies needed to neutralize enemies at range, but armor was too thick for bodkins, targets were too dispersed for broadheads, and conditions were wrong for fire? That's where our fourth arrow type enters. And this one didn't rely on penetration, burning, or bleeding. It relied on something far more insidious. Poison. Arrow 4, the poison arrow, the silent killer. The poison arrow operated on a principle that ancient warriors understood intimately. You don't need to kill your enemy in battle. You just need to make sure they die after battle. Here's what makes poison arrows uniquely terrifying. A soldier could be struck by what seemed like a minor wound. Maybe the arrow glanced off a shield, or caught them in the arm, or barely penetrated leather armor, and walk away thinking they'd survived. Then, hours or days later, their nervous system would begin shutting down, or their blood would stop clotting, or their heart would simply stop beating. The poison arrow turned every wound, no matter how minor, into a potential death sentence. Let's start with what actually worked, because Hollywood has lied to you about poison arrows. The Scythians, nomadic warriors who dominated the steppes from roughly 700 to 300 BCE, were perhaps the most sophisticated poison arrow users in history. Greek historians wrote about them with a mix of awe and horror. The word toxic itself comes from the Greek toxikon, meaning arrow poison. Here's their recipe, preserved in ancient texts. They would take snake venom, usually from vipers, and mix it with decomposed human blood and animal dung. This mixture would be sealed in containers and buried for weeks, allowing bacterial cultures to develop. The result wasn't just venom anymore. It was a cocktail of neurotoxins, hemotoxins, and septic bacteria. Why does that matter? Because even if the venom degraded during storage or lost potency, the bacterial infection would still kill. This was biological warfare before anyone had a word for it. But here's where it gets strategically interesting. Scythian archers didn't coat their entire arrow supply with poison. That would be inefficient and dangerous to handle. Instead, they would prepare specific arrows for specific targets, usually leadership, officers, or heavily armored opponents who might survive conventional arrow wounds. A Scythian warrior might fire dozens of regular arrows during a skirmish, but the one poisoned arrow would be saved for a high-value target. Hit a commander with a poison arrow, and even if he survives the immediate battle, he's incapacitated within hours. An army that loses its leadership mid-campaign often disintegrates without another arrow being fired. Sub-Saharan African warriors developed their own versions using plant-based toxins that were, in some ways, even more sophisticated. The most famous was derived from strophanthus plants, what locals called poison rope. The active compounds were cardiac glycosides, similar to what we now use in heart medications, but in concentrated doses they would cause arrhythmia, cardiac arrest, and death within minutes to hours depending on the dose. Here's the genius. These toxins were absorbed through bloodstream, but they were relatively harmless if ingested. That meant warriors could safely carry treated arrows, even in their mouths during climbing or swimming, without risk of self-poisoning. But the moment that arrow broke skin and entered the bloodstream, the countdown began. South American tribes, particularly in the Amazon, took poison arrow technology to what might be its apex. They used curare, a muscle relaxant extracted from various plants through a process so complex it required specialized knowledge passed down through generations. Curare is fascinating from a military perspective because it doesn't cause pain, inflammation, or obvious symptoms. A target struck by a curare-tipped arrow would feel the impact, maybe some initial pain from the wound itself, but then nothing alarming. Maybe some weakness, some difficulty moving the affected limb. Within minutes, the paralysis would spread. Breathing muscles would stop responding. The victim would remain completely conscious, aware, thinking, seeing, but unable to move, speak, or breathe. Death by asphyxiation would follow in 5 to 15 minutes. Imagine being in a hand-to-hand battle and watching your opponent suddenly collapse, unable to move but clearly still alive, eyes tracking you, trying to speak but unable to make sound. The psychological effect on other soldiers witnessing this was profound. But here's what ancient armies figured out, and what makes poison arrows particularly insidious. You didn't need lethal doses. Chinese military texts from the Warring States period describe poison arrows designed not to kill, but to incapacitate. Mix toxins that caused severe pain, disorientation, or temporary paralysis, and suddenly you've removed an enemy from combat without killing them, which actually creates a bigger problem for their army. Why? Because a dead soldier is just a body, but a wounded, poisoned soldier requires carriers, medics, and resources to transport and treat. Every incapacitated soldier pulls multiple other soldiers out of combat to deal with them. It's resource warfare through chemistry. Persian armies used this strategically during conflicts with Rome. Arrowheads would be treated with substances that caused severe gastrointestinal distress, vomiting, diarrhea, dehydration. Not immediately lethal, but devastating to unit cohesion and morale. Roman legions, famous for their discipline, would begin to break down as soldiers became too sick to march, fight, or even stand guard. And here's the darkest aspect of poison arrows: the antidote problem. Most cultures that developed poison arrow technology also developed rudimentary antidotes or treatments, usually involving inducing vomiting, applying poultices, or using other plant compounds to slow absorption. But here's the catch: these treatments only worked if you knew you'd been poisoned, knew what poison was used, and had the treatment immediately available. In the chaos of battle, with dozens or hundreds of wounds to triage, how do you identify which arrows were poisoned? You can't. So every wound becomes suspicious, every arrow strike requires treatment as if it might be poisoned, and medical resources are overwhelmed by both actual poison cases and paranoia. Some armies started using poison arrows specifically to create this medical chaos, even if only a tiny fraction of their arrows were actually treated. But poison arrows had limitations. They required preparation, degraded over time, could poison the user if mishandled, and were expensive to produce. For mass warfare, armies needed something more reliable, more consistent, more scalable. And that brings us to our fifth and final arrow type, one that might surprise you, because its lethality came not from what it was made of, but from how it was made. Arrow 5, the whistling arrow, the coordinator. The whistling arrow wasn't designed to pierce armor, tear flesh, spread fire, or deliver poison. It was designed to do something that would fundamentally change how battles were fought. It turned sound into strategy. Picture the Mongol Empire at its height, 13th century, the largest contiguous land empire in history. How did relatively small Mongol armies defeat forces many times their size? Superior tactics? Yes. Better horses? Absolutely. But here's what gave them a coordination advantage that seemed almost superhuman: whistling arrows. These weren't arrows with random holes that happened to make noise. They were precision-engineered communication devices. The arrowhead would be carved from bone or wood with multiple chambers and apertures, each configuration producing a different pitch and tone. A high-pitched whistle might mean cavalry charge from the left. A lower, warbling sound could signal feigned retreat. A sharp, single-tone shriek, concentrate fire on this location. Mongol commanders could direct thousands of mounted archers across miles of battlefield without saying a word, using volleys of whistling arrows as a sonic command system. Defending armies would hear the whistles, understand they were signals, but have no idea what they meant, which added a layer of psychological warfare to the tactical advantage. The brilliance was in the speed. Shouted commands can be misheard in battle. Flag signals require visual line of sight. But a whistling arrow could be heard across a battlefield, over the chaos of combat, and processed instantly by trained warriors who'd spent years learning the meanings. This is how nomadic armies consistently outmaneuvered larger, more heavily armed opponents. They could change tactics in real time, mid-battle, while their enemies were still trying to relay orders through traditional command chains. Chinese dynasties, after centuries of fighting Mongol and steppe nomads, adopted and refined the technology. They developed whistling arrows called Mingdi, some versions of which could be heard over a mile away. These weren't just for military use. They were used for hunting coordination, ceremonial displays, and even as psychological tools to intimidate opponents before battle even began. Here's the final insight. The whistling arrow represents something profound about ancient warfare. The deadliest weapon isn't always the one that draws the most blood. Sometimes it's the one that lets you coordinate violence more effectively than your enemy can respond. So there you have it. 5 arrow types, each one a window into the brutal ingenuity of ancient warfare. From the armor-piercing bodkin to the flesh-destroying broadhead, from the chaos of fire arrows to the insidious lethality of poison, and finally to the whistling arrow that turned sound into strategy. These weren't just weapons. They were tactical solutions to specific problems, each one proving that in war, innovation isn't just about making something deadlier, it's about making something smarter. If you found this fascinating, hit that subscribe button. There's a lot more history to uncover.